Hey, welcome back. Sorry it's been a while. In this video I'm going to follow up my J.W. Steelman video and just go through the 4 points very briefly, just to explain why the issues that I've outlined in the J.W. Steelman video just don't hold enough water for it to be convincing. And so the first point I raised was the Kalem cosmological argument. Even though the witnesses don't call it the Kalem argument, it is essentially some form or version of that. And the idea that the universe had a beginning has reached, or did reach, a consensus. But that consensus, like almost all scientific consensus, comes under challenge eventually and gets replaced by a different idea. Now, it's not that the Big Bang model is being discarded, but it is coming under increasing challenges. And some of the best minds in the world are proposing alternative theories that re-establish this idea of an eternal universe, not least among them being the mathematician Roger Penrose. Now, this idea that the universe had a beginning essentially is tied to this idea that when you take the equations of general relativity and work them backwards, you come to what's called a singularity, which means that at some stage the universe was infinitely small, infinitely dense, and infinitely hot, while also at the same time having a high degree of order contained within it. This just really doesn't make any sense. And so the singularity idea is really just a label given to something that we don't fully understand yet. And this is really the quest for a theory of quantum gravity or a theory of everything. And we're not there yet. And various different theories and hypotheses have been put forth. And so the idea that the universe definitely had a beginning is not for sure, and is increasingly being questioned by leading scientific minds. In addition to that, in the Kalem cosmological argument, one of the premises, whatever begins to exist has a cause, is certainly applicable to everything in the universe. But it doesn't necessarily apply to the universe itself. Or at least this is an argument that some people put forth to question that premise. Now, I think that might be a little bit of a step too far. And I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of it, mostly because I'm not qualified to do that. I don't understand the issues well enough. But if you want something to get your teeth into that's really very interesting, but lacks the combative, ego clashing of many other videos, I highly recommend Alex O'Connor, also known as the Cosmic Skeptic on YouTube, discussing the Kalem cosmological argument with William Lane Craig himself. It's a really interesting discussion. You're certain to learn something from it. And if you're unfamiliar with Cosmic Skeptic's channel, you really should check him out. There's some wonderful content on there. And I'll put a link for that particular video in the description below. Now, the second point I raised was that the Bible is unique in that it's been distributed more than any other book in history, and it was suppressed by the Catholic Church, which was for a long time the most powerful institution on earth. Now, the Bible's history is very storied and very interesting, and it is really quite remarkable that the book has survived and been distributed in such a fashion. But there are other books that have been widely distributed and that are very revered and unique to particular cultures in their own context. You take, for example, the book of Koran, which is much more recent than the Bible and has a distribution of about 1 billion. You have the Bhagavad Gita, which is very precious to the Hindu community in India. You have, in communist China, you have the Little Red Book, which is quotations and saying from Mao Zedong, which estimates of its distribution go from 800 million to even 6 billion, which would put it on par with the Bible itself. And so the simple fact that a book has been really widely distributed right throughout the world is not in and of itself evidence of anything. We would not, or certainly Christians and Jehovah's Witnesses certainly would not attribute special or divine status to the Koran, and especially not a communist propaganda piece, just because it's been distributed 1 billion or more times. In fact, you take some modern books like 50 Shades of Grey. It sold 150 million copies. And this is just merely soft porn for women. Just because something is popular and widely bought or distributed says nothing about its content except that it's popular. Now, sometimes something is both popular and deep and profound and useful and interesting, but those often don't correlate together. And so simply asserting that it's popular or being distributed widely really says nothing in and of itself about its origins or its content. Point number 3 was that the Bible reveals God's purposes gradually and deliberately over time, that it is necessary and relevant to the cultural context that the people of the time found themselves in. Now, I find this really very, very weak because it really sidesteps the idea that there are as many ways to interpret the Bible as there are Christian religions, by definition. Why is it that God's purpose can be understood and interpreted in pretty much an infinite amount of ways? It doesn't make any sense to say that God's purpose has been revealed gradually over time when no one can seem to agree on what that is. The mistake that Jehovah's Witnesses make, along with almost all other Christian, and especially the fundamentalist Christian religions, is that they retrospectively superimpose an interpretation of the text onto the text itself, and then they assert that this interpretation is the original meaning of the text and can't be changed or altered in any way. And so when someone has internalized an interpretation or a dogma based on a text, whenever they read that text, they are seeing it through the lens of that dogma. And so reading the text itself only recapitulates the dogma, so it becomes a never-ending cycle of reinforcement. You have the dogma internalized, so everything you read in the text reaffirms the dogma. And it just goes on like that forever. And it's very, very difficult to get across to someone that all they really have is a dogma. And the text that they claim to revere is not what their belief system is. It is the dogmatic reinterpretation of the text's meaning that they really have the reverence for. The fourth point was that there's always been a group of people on earth that God uses to guide and direct his people. Now, the further claim then, of course, is that the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses are this group of people that God is using. This is just nonsense. You might ask yourself, who was God using to direct his people after the final prophet, Malachi, was preaching in 420 BCE right up to the time of Jesus? Who was leading God's people then? Where was the group of people leading God's people, let alone God's people themselves, from the 1st century CE right up until the time of the establishment of the Watchtower organization? Jehovah's Witnesses claim that there was a group of people that worshipped him and that was led by the faithful and discreet slave through this entire 2,000-year history. Where are these people? Who are they? They make no mention of them. They just insist that that was the case, without offering even a single example of who that was. And so there are vast tracts of time for which there is no group of people, let alone a leader or a group of leaders, to guide God's supposed people. This is just something that the Watchtower organization asserts in order to give legitimacy to their own claims to power and authority. And what's very interesting about this is that it's a very, very well-used tactic of high control groups and mass movements. As Eric Hoffer says in The True Believer, mass movements will probably trace their origins to the distant past from a desire to demonstrate the legitimacy of the movement and to show up the present as a mere interlude between past and future. This is precisely the tactic the governing body uses. It claims that there's always been a group of people that God has used to guide his people, and that they are the ones that God is now using, in effect attaching themselves to all these ancient groups of people like Moses and Jesus and the apostles, whoever these groups of people were. The governing body then say, we are the modern manifestation of that. And they also connect themselves to this ancient heritage while disdaining the present and looking forward to some glorious future, where they, of course, are resurrected as immortal kings in heaven. So they're just 4 points that I wanted to address, because no matter how well you dress up Jehovah's Witnesses dogma, just scratching beneath the surface reveals that it is just that. It is a dogma. And no matter what bells and whistles you want to put on it, it all comes down to one thing. There is a group of men in New York that tell you what the Bible means, what world conditions mean, and what you need to do to get everlasting life. It's not the Bible, it's not God. It's a couple of dudes, old men in New York, who are telling you everything, and you can't question it. This is a dogma. And when you are punished severely for deviating from that dogma, you now enter the realms of high control groups or cults. So while the message of Jehovah's Witnesses sometimes can be very appealing, and the people themselves individually can be very kind, very generous, and very loving, the message that they preach and the things that they believe really boil down to following 8 guys in New York. Okay, that's all for this time. I'll see you again.